I actually remember seeing this old Chick-fil-A commercial, and at the beginning, there's this guy who's just standing in a hole, and a woman walks up to him and says, "Hey, like, what are you doing?" And he's like, "Oh, I'm just having a sandwich." And she said, "It looks like you're stuck in a rut." And he said, "I thought it was a groove." And she said, "Classic rut thinking." And it was like a really interesting video. And then, of course, they promote their Chick-fil-A breakfast sandwich, moving away from the traditional uh, bacon and egg sandwich, I guess, whatever. But it's something that I really struck me when I first saw that video, because how many times are we actually stuck in a rut, but we think it's a groove, that we're actually in a good space? And one of my favorite quotes ever, and I can't remember who to attribute to, again, not mine. All the best stuff ever said is not from me. It is to innovate, disrupt your routine. And I think sometimes, even when we're doing things that we think we're successful at and are going really well, do we sometimes, shock our system? And I'll give you an example. This podcast, I've been blogging for years and years and years, and I love it. And there is no reason for me to kind of go away from it. And even though I still do blog and I do love writing, I do love connecting, I wanted to try something different. I wanted to try this. And so maybe my writing was getting stale for myself. Maybe this podcast is getting stale. I don't know. But I think sometimes what I try to do is I try to find these little ways to kind of just disrupt things. And I think when I work out, when I exercise, if you kind of go and do the same program over and over and over again, your body gets used to it. And what happens when your body gets used to these things, it actually doesn't let you grow anymore. And so you have to disrupt. You have to try different things, and that actually shocks your body. And I think it's the same thing with our lives, that we have to just try different things to kind of shock ourselves and really kind of thinking about this. And this is why I really enjoyed this conversation with Becca Ribbing, who wrote the book, The Clarity Journal, really kind of having us kind of look back and ask ourselves, are we actually in a rut or in a groove, and kind of thinking about that and how we move forward to really kind of open up doors for ourselves, which ultimately will open up doors for our kids. I really enjoyed this podcast. Really made me think. I hope you enjoyed it as well. Welcome back to another episode of the Innovator's Mindset Podcast. Hey everyone, it's George Couros, another episode of the Innovator's Mindset Podcast. And I'm really excited here. I was just having a great conversation right before with Becca Ribbing, and she's actually a coach and a writer, and she actually wrote the Clarity Journal. And if you actually look in the description down below, you'll see a link to this. As we were talking, I didn't tell you this. You mentioned some stuff that you had an issue with being chiropractor, which freaked me out because I'm actually just starting chiropractor. I'm like, oh no, am I going to be in trouble for this? So hopefully mine works out well. But hey, it's been great to kind of talk to you before the podcast. I'm looking forward to to learning more about the work that you do and really how it can actually help education. So if you could actually just, take a second to introduce yourself, tell us who you are, what you do today, and actually how you got to that point.
So I am a coach. I focus on helping people figure out what they're going to do next with their lives. And so, we all get into that period where we're stuck and we feel like we don't know what is the next step or where we're going to go next. I think that a lot of times that happens because we aren't really aware that it always happens. It comes in a cycle. We take one thing that we're doing, we master it, and as soon as we master it, it's no longer a challenge, and then we're looking for the next thing, or we're hoping we'll get a promotion, but a lot of times, if we aren't recognizing where we are right now, we lose our agency, and we just hope the universe or our boss or somehow the next step will become clear instead of taking back control of it. And so I help people really take back control of it and figure out what's authentic to them.
So how did you get to this being a topic? Like, this is actually something that you found an interest in. Like, how did you get to that space?
I think I've always been in this space. I have a very vivid memory from when I was 12. and my grandfather was picking me up from a friend's house. It was in the middle of summer. He was in an old beat up car that I'm pretty sure didn't have air conditioning, or the air conditioning didn't work. And he's just complaining about work. I'm asking him
Right.
how his day went, and he's like, "Ah, it was awful." And that stuck with me. I mean, for decades,
Right.
because as soon as I asked him, as 12-year-old inquisitive kids do, "Well, why don't you get another job?" It's like, "Oh, we don't get other jobs. We stay at this job until we retire, and then we'll have a good life." And I just so strongly was like, "This is not going to work for me. I can't do that." And so then, bopping along, I'm a teenager and then 20s, and you think in your 20s you know everything, right? You go to university, you think you know exactly what you're gonna do. Well,
Mm.
some of us do. I did. And I get out into the real world, and it's not what I wanted. Like, what I thought I wanted wasn't what I wanted. And because it was the real world. It wasn't like school. Like, it wasn't just, like, writing cool papers. It was actually, like, working in an office environment much more collaboratively, and it was something that I just wasn't that interested in. So, I did a ton of soul searching. I read all of the books, and as I was reading all of the books, taking the Myers-Briggs test, doing the strength
Right.
finders, everything, I started helping all my friends. All my friends were in that same spot. They were in their mid-20s, and they were like, "I thought I knew what I wanted. I didn't know what I wanted," or they got pigeonholed and were stuck in an admin job or something that wasn't using their strengths. And so I started coaching them, like, just, over
Mhm.
happy hour, over coffee, like, on a walk. And as they started getting jobs, and as I started, like, really seeing that I was helping them, I realized I really wanted to be a coach, and this was my thing.
Well, actually, as you're telling the story, I was thinking about this, and I'll link it down below. There's a really great talk by Jim Carrey, the comedian, right?
Mhm.
I'm sure you're familiar, right? Jim Carrey, but he talks about his dad, and his dad always wanted to be a comedian. And basically, his dad was an accountant. I think it was an accountant, and he had basically spent his life not doing what he wanted to do and was miserable. And then he actually ended up getting laid off in his 50s from being an accountant. And it's like basically the message of the story is that sometimes when you stick with the things that you don't want to do, that could actually turn out poorly as well. Right. So why not
Yeah.
actually go take an opportunity for the things that you actually really want to do. And like thinking about that lesson, watching your parents go through that, doing that. And there's, obviously there's reasons like we want to make sure that our kids are okay and things like that. But we do kind of get nervous about this. I want to ask you about this. And we talked about this before, really kind of how we connect this to education. There's this thing in education that happens, and I'm sure you're familiar with it. I know you're a parent, where basically we tend to kind of like, I don't know if it's kind of around your advice, but I think it's like maybe it's how it's misinterpreted, is that we will see this new initiative, we will do it for a little bit, and then we'll move on to a new initiative, do it for a little bit, and it's like it's always changing directions, and then people get so fatigued because we can't actually stick and do things right. And so like when I'm thinking about this, I can't remember if it's Malcolm Gladwell talked about the notion of like 10,000 hours, right? Like you have to
Right.
put in a ton of time to become an expert at something. But then in school, a lot of times we don't give our staff the opportunity to actually really dig into something, and then they're just overwhelmed. So where do you kind of see that, where like when do you kind of decide like, hey, this is something that we need to stick with and get really good at, versus like identifying when it is a problem. Maybe it isn't the best direction for us to go. Because I think, like I try to, there's a lot of things I've been doing over and over and over again for years, and they get progressively better. And there's things that I absolutely love doing, but I've also, I kind of sometimes when I feel like, hey, this isn't working for me anymore, I'm okay to drop stuff. Like I'm okay to move on from it. So how do people kind of identify the difference between those two things?
So I think For me, and I spend a lot of time talking about this. Starting friction is a huge thing. When you are starting something new, you're literally rebuilding the pathways and creating more connections in the way that you now need to think. And it's so funny that you say that because, like, right now, my kids' school is changing their math curriculum.
Right, right,
And they just changed their math curriculum. Like, I've got a 7-year-old, and they had just changed the math curriculum when my older one was approximately the same grade, so probably about 6 years ago. And I think that there is this fine line of taking data and recognizing when something isn't working,
mhm,
and also recognizing that at the beginning, you're not gonna be that great at it. I often use the example of podcasting because I think podcasting is such a great example that people can really understand even if they're not podcasters. I am not a podcaster. I just like
right,
going on other people's podcasts. But like, if you're a podcaster, you have to learn how to audio edit, you have to learn how to market, you have to learn how to ask insightful, interesting questions to keep both the person you're interviewing engaged as well as the audience. There's a lot of different skills involved. Well, if you look up how many podcasts the average podcast has, it's 7, because
wow,
most people hit 2, 3, 4 and stop because they weren't aware of how much work it was going to be. But that work gets so much easier. Audio editing gets easier the more you do it. So I think that when you are at the beginning of a path, you have to recognize it's going to be a struggle. Like, none of it's going to be rote. It's going to be hard. And you really have had to think through that this hardness is going to be worth it for these reasons. But then you also have to be looking for, is the hardness getting easier? Like,
mm,
is there something wrong in my approach? Because I mean, with everything, I had like we've the approach may or may not work for you. Like, a lot of times we like to throw the kitchen sink at it. Like, I can do everything, and then you vastly overestimate how much time you have. And so really focusing on your strengths to me is the best way to evaluate whether or not something is working. Like, is this using my strengths?
right.
Is this using my core competencies? Am I seeing a trajectory where this will become easier to implement? This will become what I need it slash want it slash hope for it to be. I think that the problem is sometimes also when you're talking about groups of people, it's like what works for one person doesn't work for another person. And oftentimes, the person that is teaching has a strength in what they are teaching, and so doesn't necessarily understand the pitfalls of why that person isn't understanding. And I think that as you get out of, like, you know, K5. K5, I think that people do, like, teachers usually understand, like, "Oh, a kid
Mhm,
doesn't understand this." But, like, when you get into, like, adult training, like, taking back um, the training that my school is about to go through,
mhm,
a lot of those people, we don't realize it, but they love it. Like, they love that system, and that's why they're teaching it, and they're not necessarily going to be great at handling the people that don't like it, or the people that this
right.
is not how their brain works. And I think that that's unfortunate when we are talking about training anyone or learning anything, because it's really putting the burden on the person that doesn't understand instead of the burden on the teacher.
Well, the interesting thing when you're talking about like school districts or schools changing programs, the reality of this is, and I kind of found this dirty little secret. It's basically not about necessarily, hey, what do we think is the most beneficial for kids? Because sometimes, and this, I'm not saying, by the way, I'm not saying schools. I'm actually more pointing to politicians right now. I actually remember we were in, so where I live in Alberta, Canada, we've had basically the same party government for like a long amount of time, but then they actually had a new leader, right? So the new
Mhm.
leader brings in new people, and we actually had like this really great education. I actually remember sharing something from it. I'm like, wow, this is actually good from the government for education, which is I find rare. And so I was sharing it, but then someone comes in new and then they change it, not because it wasn't working, but because of their ego, because they don't want to just take on someone else's program. And it's just kind of like interesting to see that. And it's like it just, and that happens so many times in education. Like you have one government in and they have a belief system and they want the credit. So like even if the education system is working really well in an area, but there's a new party coming in, they're like, no, we got to change it because we want the credit for it. And that's what I've seen so many times, and it's really frustrating, kind of to see that process. I think when you're talking about the other element of podcasting, right? So I've been podcasting, I've been doing this for a couple of years now, and I showed up basically on time to do this. I got my camera set up, I got my little sound, board, I got everything. So I just have to like press a couple buttons and I'm going. But before it was like, you're trying to learning a system, you're trying to go through that process. But I think a lot of times what people do is they just say, and we publish books. Hey, I want to write a book. And I'm like, why do you want to write a book? Well, because I want to write a book. And I'm like, but what do you want to talk about? And I think people just want to write that book and
Right.
so they can check something off of their life list. And for me, it's like, I actually want to publish people that really have something they want to say and get it out and they're passionate about it. And I feel that if you focus on that, the audience will come to you. You'll build that. People go, but if it doesn't work, and I think a lot of times the reason why probably people quit their podcast is not only that some of the stuff's hard, it's that they want the immediate success. They want it that minute, and they struggle with not having it. And the reason they struggle not having it is because they went into it for the wrong reasons. They went in for because they say they want to have a podcast, not because they want, like, I actually really just love talking to people. And I'm like, might as well record it and then do a podcast, right? And so that's something that I've really been thinking about. One of the things I want to ask you about, and I kind of triggered, I'm really big into social media. I probably watch way too much TikTok, things like this. And I'm like way into YouTube culture. Like I actually probably know what most like, 14-year-old boys know about or like TikTok and YouTube. I'm just like, I know this stuff and it kind of like throws young people off. And it's kind of like, it's interesting, but it's also stuff I want to know because of, my work with students. And one of the things that I've watched that is interesting is that someone will have like a YouTube channel and it will be like massive and it will be like blowing up and doing really well. And then they'll just kind of stop it and then they'll move to a different platform and they will find success in that space. And it's like I actually kind of give them credit because it's like they see kind of an end in sight where they're going to kind of hit this high, and before it starts going down, starts going down a different level, they actually exit into something else and then they lift that thing up. And so
Interesting.
it's not because they're frustrated, it's not because they're not doing well. It's just they're kind of saying like, hey, am I becoming repetitive? Do I need to go like in a different way, kind of going through that process? And so it's like, I think sometimes, weirdly enough, success can actually be a disadvantage because you sometimes might lose what made you successful in the first place. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on why people do that or how that kind of works, because sometimes we quit things early because we want to jump into a different direction even while they're successful.
Well, I think that, like, look, no one's listening to your podcast that wants to stay static. So there are people out there, like my grandfather, who just want to do the same thing over and over again, but they're not listening to innovation podcasts.
Right.
And, and so for your listeners, I would say that the thing is that there could be two things going on.
Right.
There is fear of success. Totally, fear of success is a thing, and I have seen a lot of what you've noticed with
Hmm.
especially YouTube. Like something goes viral, they get a ton of followers, and
Right.
then all of a sudden, like there's nothing like 5 years later. And they're not on TikTok. They just froze up. So that's one thing. That is definitely a fear of success. like, wasn't necessarily setting yourself up for realizing that even success is hard.
Right.
Success comes with its own challenges that you'd have to be persistent through. However, I think on the other hand, and we're kind of living in the ADHD culture,
Mhm.
to begin with, but I think that when we talk about life purpose, we often are still stuck in the 1950s. Like, you talk about your life purpose, and it's going to be like, I am going to be a teacher for the rest of my life, or I am going to do this for the rest of my life. And a couple of weeks ago, there was a job description floating around the internet that I don't remember. I don't know. I don't remember. I don't know whether it was real or photoshopped, but
Right.
basically, the job description, the first line was social media manager must have 15 to 20 years experience.
Right. Uh,
And it's like,
Amazing.
that tells you absolutely zero about how good or bad a person is at
Right.
social media. Um,
Must have been good at ICQ, right? Like,
Right? I'm,
it's
like, sitting here, like, 20 years ago, what was, like, I guess MySpace?
right,
Like,
right, right.
does that count as
MSN
social media?
Messenger, right? MSN
Right.
Messenger.
AOL, like, I don't know. So, the jobs that we're preparing kids for, the jobs
Mm,
that we're preparing ourselves for, unless we're, like, 70, they're going to keep changing and
mhm,
evolving. And so if we are stuck in this 1950s mentality of, I'm gonna figure out my life purpose and I'm gonna do it for the rest of my life, you're setting yourself up for disappointment because you're going to take that challenge, you'll go get the next job, you'll take that challenge, and then you'll grow to a point where it's no longer a challenge. And so I would suggest that if someone is doing it well,
mhm,
and they, got really big on YouTube, but then decided to go to TikTok, and now they're doing really well because they took they blended what they knew
right,
into this new challenge, this new format. Like, that can be really, um, growth mindset oriented.
right,
Like,
right, right.
maybe they saw TikTok as like, "You know what? I really like the short snippets. Like, that
Yeah.
I could really master easily." But then, in another 3 years, TikTok is gonna be kind of, oh,
Say it again.
so
So
2021 or
I like
2020.
I like TikTok. I'm still upset about Vine going away. I don't know if you remember
I
Vine.
know,
Vine
I
was like
know.
perfect amount 6 seconds, that's all I need, right?
So, I think that, like, at a certain level, this is all about mindfulness. It's like, of knowing what your own motivations are and whether you're being driven by the positive or the negative,
Right.
because it could go either way, and I think a lot of people looking outside looking in are gonna tell you what they think, like, are you
Mhm.
doing a good thing or a bad thing? But only you know whether you're reacting out of negative inspiration or positive inspiration.
Yeah, and I think that purpose really matters, right? And I actually, when I and this is me being pretty vulnerable here. I wrote Innovator's Mindset, and it has done phenomenal. It's done very very well, and I've written 2 books since, and they haven't done as well, right? And you kind of feel like, am I like Chumbawamba? Am I like like is this it? Is this my one thing? And I'll put it like, do you know what I mean?
I
But I
do.
actually don't. I don't really. I don't get caught up in that because I don't write to put out books, but I put out books when I feel I'm like I always say, like a book has to come to you. It's not
Right.
something that I just want to force out of me and have this cycle, right? And I think sometimes what I do is I try to follow my passions and see where they lead me. And then if I keep, kind of focusing on that, what draws it to me? Like I was actually talking to a friend just on text right before this message, and I started this podcast called Mindset Monday, and basically it's just kind of talking about like your own personal well-being, how you take care of your health. And I'll post this every Monday, and it's actually people are really interested in what I'm talking about, and I think they're interested because I'm really passionate about it, and I can kind of feel a pull to this. And it's not that I don't love education, it's not that I don't love some of the stuff that I do, but right now this is what I'm passionate about, and this is what I'm kind of getting into. So that I just kind of look at that, and I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier. When I have something to say, then I feel comfortable putting out a book, but I'm not trying to like recreate the success of Innovator's Mindset. And that's not what I'm trying to do. I think that finding those passions and that purpose is what I'm really most excited about. And so speaking about books, I do want to ask you about the clarity journal and what it is, and just kind of tell us like how could it, how is it helpful to, people maybe both in and out of education.
So, the Clarity Journal basically came about when I was kind of in a dark space. My first trimester of my pregnancy with my second kid, I had a bad chiropractic adjustment and I had to walk with a cane on and off. Like
Mm.
no one could help fix it because the ligaments were loose because of pregnancy. And and then we moved in my third trimester from the East Coast to Seattle. And then the baby was born with a load of ear infection. Like he had
Mm.
tons and tons of ear infections. So it's just like this constant, like there's just
Right.
always something
Right.
going wrong. There was something keeping me from doing, the outside creative stuff that I loved.
Mhm.
And then like as these things happen, like,
Right.
this too shall pass. It passed. Like like my baby is now older. He was like a lot easier to handle because he was no longer in pain. And the funny thing is when we hit those points, a lot of times instead of being really grateful, even though you can have gratitude that you're past it, you've let go of so much that you are missing something that you don't even really recognize that you're missing. And I was there. I
Mhm.
had, kept my clients and that's about it. I hadn't done any marketing. I really like kind of fell off the face of the planet. I was really fortunate that I have enough clients that like
Right.
love me and talk me up that my business kept going, but nothing else. Like I didn't do any of my
Mhm.
blogging. I didn't do anything. And so I was complaining about this with a friend. Like, I don't know what to do next. I don't know what direction to go in. Like, I've been so underwater for so long. And as I was talking to her, because she's a fabulous person and a wonderful friend, she stopped me and she said, Becca, you're a coach. What would you tell
Right.
yourself? Like,
Right.
if you were a client? And that hit me like a ton of bricks. And I just went and I wrote down every question I could think of to help people get unstuck. And as I was writing them down and as I was doing them, going through them, it just really helped me figure out for myself like what my next challenge was, what like the next part of this journey needed to entail. And I think that this is important because educators are responsible for helping kids through their own process. And also, educators are adults. Educators are
Mhm.
human. You might need your own change. Maybe you've been in the
Right.
same classroom for 10 years, or maybe you're in a toxic environment. Like, it's important to recognize when you need a change, and you can't really help other people if you're unhappy.
Right.
So, I think that a lot of people in professions that are still more traditionally mindset, like you go get the education and then you're in that same job forever unless you become a principal or you're a nurse. Nursing is often very similar. It's like you're in that same job
Right.
forever unless you maybe go get like a master's and become like a midwife, like a nurse practitioner.
Right. Right. Right.
Um, there are a couple jobs that are like that, but it becomes really easy to just follow the same path. But if you're unhappy, you're going to be snapping at your students.
Right.
If you're unhappy, you're not going to be bringing your best self. And I think that we often forget, both with our family and with our workplace, that if we are not showing up for ourselves in with our
Right.
best self, we're not doing anyone any good.
When I was listening to you, I'm thinking about some of the relationships I've had in the past, right? And
Uh-huh.
some of the stuff that I put up with, I would be like, I would never be okay with one of my friends doing it. And then when you kind of like sometimes when you leave those relationships, you kind of have this outer body experience, and then you're like, what was I thinking, right? And it's sometimes really hard to like actually take your best advice that you give to others when you're in the middle of, maybe this isn't the best terminology, but a storm, right? You feel
Mhm.
you're in that storm and you don't really observe stuff. But I always try to do this. I always try to like kind of step outside of myself and try to look at the situation almost as a third party, even though I'm in the situation, saying like, what would I do in this situation? Like, what, as you said, what would I advice would I give, to like a friend of mine, someone I really cared about? Because we often give our best advice to other people and we never take it for ourselves. And when you look at some of the times, like right now in education, there's a huge kind of mental, like, I don't want to say it's a mental health crisis. And it's not just with students, I think it's with the adults as well. And I think sometimes when we tolerate, for example, administrators that maybe don't make the best decisions, and everyone, like, we complain kind of behind the scenes, but we also stay,
Right.
and we're kind of just saying that's okay, and then it continues on, right? But if there
Yep.
was ever like a mass exodus from a school, that would probably tell something's going on, right? And there's like,
Yeah.
hey, what's going on here that people don't want to work at this space? And so I think sometimes, like, again, referencing, I've shared this before, a Will Smith um, video. Basically, he talked about this idea that when you pin the blame on other people, then you also give them the responsibility to fix it, whether they want to or not, right? And it's
Mhm.
not that you can't be upset with other people, and it's not that you can't be bothered by their actions, but it's like you always have control over like how you react to things, how you deal with stuff going forward. And I think for me, that's one of the things that I've really learned, especially about myself over the last few years. And believe me, I'm not a master at it, right? I'm sure you'd probably say the same thing, right? You wrote a book, but we're never 100% on our own advice too. But it's like taking charge of a situation, and sometimes that's some tough decisions, like, maybe cutting people out of my life that I feel make things worse for me, right?
Right.
Being very cognizant of who I give my time to, right? One of the things that I measure is if I'm around someone who makes me unhappy after then I'm around my kids, they're out. That's it. I
Mm.
don't spend any time with that, because if it actually affects my children because of that, then I just don't have the time for that, and I'll surround myself that, I can give my kids my best energy. So
Yeah.
I don't know what you think about that, because I think it is like what you're saying is like it's kind of finding your own control through that process.
It is. Well, and I think that this has a lot of application both to teaching and to adult life,
Mhm.
and to parenthood, really, because so I homeschool my oldest son,
Mm.
and he's like goes to a hybrid school. He's technically a public school student, but the public schools in Washington have these public schools that are set up for
Yep.
homeschoolers, and I can just sign him up for whatever he wants. And when I started homeschooling, I was expecting everybody to question whether he was gonna be socialized, like
Right.
how is he gonna find friends? Like, how is he
Right,
like
right,
blah
right.
blah blah. But the thing that everybody actually asked me was how is he going to learn how to deal with difficult people? And I'm like, well, there are difficult people everywhere. Like I
Right.
can be difficult. Like he is inherently, if he is seeing people, he's going to be dealing with difficult people. And what the school system sometimes does is it plugs you in with a teacher for a year,
Right.
and then that teacher is changed, and none of it is under any of your control. And
Mhm.
so when you're taking kids and putting them through this system, every year they're going to get a new teacher. It doesn't matter whether they like the teacher. It doesn't matter whether they have a bully in their classroom. It doesn't matter whether they dislike their teacher or like literally can't get along with their teacher. Um, they they're still stuck for a year, and I
Right.
think that when we pull that forward, when people kept asking me that, I was like, "This is exactly what's wrong with all of my clients, is they got so used to
Right.
someone else changing their circumstances for them as kids and in college, that they don't really fully embrace the fact that they are actually their own agents and that they need to actually do it for themselves, and that
Mhm.
it is enough to leave a job if you have a horrible boss. And you're right. Like, if 20 teachers quit because the administration
Right.
is not
That's
doing well, there's a huge like undersupply of teachers right now. So it's
yeah.
pretty I would assume it's pretty easy. I don't know about Canada. In the US, it'd be pretty easy to get another job. And
Mhm.
it is funny. I actually recently saw this, not with teaching, but with a friend of mine who got another job, and half of the department quit within a month.
Oh, yeah.
And, that did make a difference. I don't know whether they fired the boss because I'm not sure whether they could, because they actually told all of those people, "We will fire her if you come back." And none of them said yes. So I don't know whether they fired her or not. But it's if you're staying in a dysfunctional
Right.
situation, all you're doing is making yourself miserable.
Yeah, and I think when you're talking about sometimes we get in these situations where, personalities are conflicted, and I think we often paint this as like one person is like evil and one person's good. And I think just sometimes personalities like conflict and maybe it's different frames, time frames, whatever. So I remember this, and again, I'm outing myself here. I was this is actually probably a student, and I still keep in contact with her, her family, and she has kids now. We were both really into basketball, and she was in my grade 9 math class. And just that time period, she was just a pain for me, just always an issue, right? And that's how I perceived it, right? And I remember she was a brilliant math student, and she came to me, or her parents came to me, and I had actually taken marks off of her, and this is like an old school teaching practice, and no one should do this anymore. And I actually like took marks away from her for attitude, right? Like her attitude was bad in my class, right? And so the mom came to me, and the mom and I are actually very good friends now, right? And she wasn't mad at
Mhm.
me at all, but she had a good question. She said to me, she said, "Hey, I noticed that my daughter, her attitude marks in your class are really low, but they're not in anyone else's class. So what do you think that's about?" And it was like basically maybe it's you, right? And it was like, and it's funny because I think we actually love the same things. That it was weird. We kind of had a conflict of personalities, and like after that, it was like different because I was like being more aware of
Mhm.
myself, because it's like easy, like, oh, that kid, blah blah blah. I'm like, oh, that kid's not having any issues in any other class except for mine. Maybe it's something I'm doing, right? And it wasn't like all the kids hated me or anything. It was just a conflict with that one kid. And so I kind of think about that too. And and I think part of it too is that she advocated for herself quite a bit, and
Mhm.
I don't think I was really used to that from a kid that age. At that time, and maybe I was like, why is this kid always talking back to me? And
Right.
I probably would tell my daughter to act the same way that she did as a student if she felt, that there's things wrong in the classroom or that she didn't like something in teaching. And I was like, but at that time, I'm not a parent, I have a different view on teaching and stuff like that. This is the more I talk, I feel this is making me just look horrible right now.
No,
So
I think it's awesome because it's
yeah,
important to also recognize, like, your own role in it. Like, and
no,
I
of course.
I I end up talking to people a lot about this because when I am working with someone at the beginning, or a lot of times even at dinner parties, like, they'll be telling me a story and be like, "Do you know XYZ is a strength of yours?" And every time I do that, they always look at me kinda like, "I don't know, it comes easy to me, like, I don't know whether I believe
Right,
you." And one of the ways I can really pinpoint and help them understand it is like, well, it came easy to you, like it comes naturally to you. And so, are you getting annoyed when other people don't do it
right,
this
right,
like
right.
your same way? Like, I think that a lot of times, like, not even just conflicts of personality, but conflicts of learning style,
Yep.
conflicts of like how your brain processes information. And I imagine the way you're talking about her, that you were also a much younger teacher, and
Oh yeah,
so
totally.
probably had a little bit to prove
Yeah.
too, because it's harder to teach when you're closer in age to the kids in some ways.
Yeah, what
But
actually, like, one of the things about I think has developed in myself over the years is, I look at, and this is now turning into a therapy session. This is when what like I look at, it was easy when you broke up with somebody to say like, oh, that person, blah blah blah.
right.
But the thing is, every time I broke up with somebody, the only constant in the situation was me, right? So I could always blame the other person, but I was always I was always the constant. The other person was the variable, right? And that changed.
Right.
So I actually am very cognizant to never say like, "Oh, that didn't work because that person did this and that person did this," because it doesn't matter. It doesn't
Right.
matter. Like now it matters maybe I guess in the sense that hey, I'm more cognizant of like things that I didn't like in the future, but I always
Mhm.
like ask like what role did I play where that didn't work out? And I think it's the same is true, in our workplace. It's easy to point at a bad boss. It's easy, and I think I've had that as opposed to like, hey, what didn't do in that situation where I could have been better, and how does that actually help me? Because my focus is not getting stuck in the past on like this person did this. It's like, hey, how do I actually move forward to get better? And so
Right.
I'm gonna ask you this last question because I know as a parent, like how do you work with your own child or like what would you suggest for kids kind of dealing with this stuff that you're talking about.
It's hard. It's hard on multiple levels because on a
Mhm.
very real level, kids always think they know everything. So when you're trying to like impart like kind of more loosey goosey stuff, um, it's hard because they already think they know it. Like I thought
Right.
I knew it, they think they know it. And some of it is just being able to recognize that they need to figure it out on their own.
Yeah.
But I think also part of it is really like with my own kids, if they are having a problem, I really put the agency back on them. Like,
Right.
I can help you with this problem, but you're going to have to figure out the solution that works for you. I just had actually uh a recent example of that. I My 7-year-old was not getting along with one of my older relatives.
Mhm.
The older relative kept trying to get his attention by teasing him,
Right.
and that doesn't really fly with kids these days.
Right.
So, he was like, no." So, we were in the car, by ourselves, and I was like, "How are you doing?" And he brought it up to me. He's like, "I'm having a hard time with
Right.
person X because they keep teasing me and I do and he was really frustrated by it. Like you could tell he just didn't understand. Like, why is this person who's like in their 70s like doing this?
Right.
Don't they know better?
Right.
And so I walked him through it. Like, okay, well, here's something like you can say because part of it is like boundaries. I think what was
Mhm.
coming to me when you were last talking is like so many of us weren't taught boundaries. And as
Right.
kids, we weren't allowed to have boundaries. And then if we're in a profession where boundaries are hard because there's a lot of rules that are like put on us
You're right.
from outside. But this is about boundaries, really. A lot of times when you're in a difficult relationship with someone, it's because you are not being as boundaried as you should. So
Right.
I walked through like, here is a suggestion for you. Why don't you try it? But I need to warn you, she may not hear it. Like, and that's
Right.
okay. If she doesn't hear it, you don't have to freak out. You just come back to me and we'll come up with a different way. And I think that that is what's important is like putting it on the kids that they can figure out the solution. Like if they're having a hard time with something, if they're having a hard time with a subject, what is a solution? Like, well, maybe a solution is let's look at a different math textbook. Let's see if there's like
Mhm.
something that like helps spur you or here's how you access tutoring. I think that a lot of times in schools, tutoring doesn't get mentioned until a kid is super far
Right.
behind. And I think that's really unfortunate because then the kid can't just take agency. Oh, I'm having a hard time with this. I'm going to go get tutoring. It's like, no, I'm failing. I need to get tutoring. And we bring that along a lot of times into adulthood too.
Yeah, and that lines up so amazingly well. And I appreciate you sharing that too, the work that I've been doing, because my focus is how do we actually really empower kids so that when they walk out of our schools, that they actually can figure out their own pathway so they can learn on their own. And I think that we are a little bit in this generation, and I don't want to be this like old crotchety guy right now, where we try to do everything for our kids. And we try to like, go and be that voice and as opposed to like I'm really trying to teach my daughters like how do you actually be that voice for yourself, right? How do you actually draw that line? And I think we have to kind of model that as adults because I don't know what when you grew up, but basically when I was a kid is like hey I'll go like I'm leaving and it's like call me and it's like well if there's a phone, right?
Right.
like if
Yep.
there's a phone, and then you could just say, "Oh, it's busy," right? Like, you can make up these lies. And it was basically like my mom would say, like, "Hey, just be home before dark and like don't go to jail." Like that was basically that was it. And then it's like now we're like having tracking devices on kids, right? And it's a
Right,
total and it actually in from what I'm aware, and I don't know if this is still true today, um, it is partly because, actually crime was worse when I was a kid for
right,
most of my but we're just way more aware of
right,
stuff, and it freaks people out, and so now we're, like, doing this to kids, and then we wonder why they don't actually can't figure some of the stuff out on their own, and they're
mhm,
kinda very dependent on other people fixing problems for them, and so I think it's
right.
something that we really do have to develop, and I think, finding that in yourself is really important, but Becky, it was wonderful having you on the podcast. I really loved your stories, and I encourage people to check out the Clarity Journal. As I said, it's in the description down below. I know your advice is helpful to me. I'm sorry for getting like I feel like I like owe you like for a therapy session or something like that. Now, kind of digging into my past, so
The
hopefully.
best podcasts go that way.
All right. Well, hey, thanks everyone for listening. Becca, thank you so much for being on. I hope you all have a wonderful day.